Welcome to Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. I'm Timothy.
And I'm Caleb.
And you're listening to Bible Discussions, the forum where we explore biblical topics that are relevant to your life. Today, we'll be continuing our series, Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? In this episode, we're going to be looking at the book of Joshua, and we're going to be talking in the Old Testament about the conquest of the land of Canaan. And in the New Testament, we're going to talk about how we are now more than conquerors through Jesus Christ. So the conquest in the Old Testament is when the Israelite people take possession of the promised land. And so, Caleb, you're the historian. When I hear a name like the promised land, there's got to be some history behind that, right? Maybe like a promise or something?
Right. It's not just a Bruce Springsteen song.
See, I'm from New Jersey, everybody. So Caleb's being nice to me
Yeah,
there
I
with
had
the
to clarify
Springsteen reference.
for him. It comes from God's promise to Abram while he was living in Canaan. But he told Abram that his people wouldn't take full possession of the land until generations, centuries later.
Okay, so that's like one of your favorite stories that we've been talking about several times so far in our sessions is this cutting of a covenant with Abraham,
Right?
Or Abram, I should say, because he hadn't had his name changed yet. So, you want to talk about that?
Sure. Read it or?
Oh yeah. Go ahead and read it if you're ready.
This is from Genesis 15:13 through 16. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and that they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the fourth generation your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure."
Okay, so this is something we talked about last session, I believe, or maybe 2 sessions ago. You were talking about the sins of the Amorites hadn't yet reached their full measure,
Right.
But here the land's being promised to Abraham, so the land's going to be taken away from people who are unfaithful and given to people who will hopefully handle the land in a faithful way.
Right, and that's something some people will point out or attempt to criticize that God sends the people in to conquer the land with war and everything that brings. But there's a sign of His mercy here because He deliberately puts that off until a later time. He doesn't want the conquest to be unjust. He wants it to happen to people who really do deserve to have it taken away from them.
Yeah, and we talked about that in the Numbers episode, I think.
I think it was Numbers.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's interesting. So this is the promise to Abraham, but it wasn't just a promise to Abraham because what's the rest of the history there?
Right. Well, he continually makes the promise to Abraham's son Isaac, to Jacob, on all through the genealogy there. But it comes up again after those 4 centuries of slavery in Egypt. It comes up with Moses at the burning bush in Exodus 3:7 through 8. The Lord said, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites." So there we see the Amorites again.
Okay, yeah. So then this is a promise to Moses, and this is when it's actually getting ready to happen, almost, sort of.
Right. Well, there is going to be a bit of a delay, as we saw in the Numbers, or is that Numbers, when Moses sends spies into the land and they come back with a good report of the land and a cowardly report of the people.
Yeah, in Numbers 13 through 14 is the entire account of that, but we're not going to read the whole thing because it's a couple chapters of the Bible, and
Right.
That'd be great homework for everybody.
We'll just focus on the most important character of all.
That might be Caleb you're speaking of? Yeah, and in Numbers 13, verses 30 through 33, I'll read that. It says, "Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, 'We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it.' But the men who had gone up with him said, 'We can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are, And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them."
Seems like a contradictory report. The land devours everyone who lives in it, and the people who live there are, huge.
Super
Like,
powerful, yeah.
yeah, that's the exact opposite of what they just said.
Everybody our size there gets devoured.
Yeah, I
But
suppose so.
yeah, but at any rate, they were trying to discourage everybody from going there because they just didn't want to take the risk, didn't want to take the chance, didn't want to work at it, I guess.
Yeah. So, and then that was in Numbers 13. In Numbers 14, 6 through 11, Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes, and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them?"
Okay, so I mean that is kind of an interesting question God asked there. He just led them out of Egypt, who Egypt was arguably the greatest power in the ancient Near East and in their world, and they had easily defeated them with God's help, and so many miraculous signs, crossing over the Red Sea, of miraculous food, and so on. And now they're like, "Oh, I don't know. This looks hard."
Yeah, well, it's stronger than that. The only people in the camp who are trying to be faithful to the Lord, the whole assembly is wanting to stone them,
Yeah,
which will not be the first time that, or the last time, that happens.
yeah. And so, interestingly, the punishment for this is that those over 20 will never see the promised land. And so that comes from Numbers 14, 26 through 30. I'll read that. It says, "The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'How long will this wicked community grumble against me? I have heard the complaints of these grumbling Israelites. So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more, who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me. Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun.'" So,
Yeah, and that even includes Moses.
congratulations.
Yeah, Moses and Aaron even. They even will die in the wilderness before entering the Holy Land.
Yeah, that's a good point. We haven't really covered that aspect for other reasons, but yeah. So there's a kind of a cleansing that God's going to do here before He brings the people into the land, because He considers these people to be unfaithful.
Yeah,
So hopefully they'll be inspired by this to do a good job with their next generation and raise them to be better people than they are. And that's kind of what all of us hope for, is that we'll do a good job raising our children and they'll have a better life than we did. So
right, and a better, more than just a material life, but will be wiser, grow, in faith, potentially more than we did.
yeah, absolutely. Well, one interesting thing that we see here is that there's two exceptions. We see the names of Joshua as well as Caleb, being praised here. And of course, we just got done saying in our introduction that we were going to talk about the book of Joshua. And so he gets his own book in the Bible, partially because of his faithfulness, partially because, as we noticed a few episodes ago, he spent his life living in the tent of meeting and talking to God. So,
yeah, he was always with Moses at the tent of meeting when everyone else just stood at the entrance of their own tent and watched.
yeah. So he's the one who's going to lead the people into the promised land. Is that right, Caleb?
Yes, that's why the book is named after him. The book which in which takes place the almost the entire conquest. So,
But
but
yeah,
you could make the argument that, and should make the argument that Joshua isn't the one leading the people. It's God Himself who drives out the inhabitants before the people.
yeah, there's some really interesting passages in Joshua that we're going to focus on because it turns out that God's the hero of pretty much every book in the Bible. Even when you have a human hero like Joshua who does really great things and makes passionate and inspiring speeches, which Joshua is remembered for, you know, throughout the book and especially at the end of the book. Um, so in Joshua 3:9 through 13, it says this. Joshua said to the Israelites, "Come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, Hittites, Hivites, Perizzites, Girgashites, Amorites, and Jebusites." Now, that's interesting because he says he's going to drive them out before them. I don't know if that's time-wise or geographically there, but they're going to run from them either just because God's chasing them out or because the people do it. Anyway, it says, "See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Now then, choose 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one from each tribe. And as soon as the priests who carry the ark of the Lord of all the earth, set foot in the Jordan, its waters flowing downstream will be cut off and stand up in a heap."
Right. That's there's obvious echoes there of the Red Sea being parted for the Israelites to cross through, and there's also from the same story, the Red Sea story. You know, Moses tells the people, "God will fight for you today," and he does. He stands in the way of Pharaoh and his chariots, and then when Pharaoh tries to follow, he sweeps the sea back over them. And here, Joshua's making the same promise that the ark's going before them, and that the Lord is going to fight for them.
Yeah, and we know that the people were afraid. We didn't include any of the story of Jericho in this presentation, although it's probably one of the most famous stories in the Old Testament of the walls of Jericho falling down. But we know that the people in Jericho were already terrified of God before He even came and pushed them out with before the Israelites came and pushed them out. And so just seeing that the people were able to cross the Jordan in this miraculous way might have been enough to get people running for the opposite border. you know.
Yeah. And we can see the direct activity of God in the conquest all throughout the book of Joshua. For example, in Joshua 13, verse 6, "As for all the inhabitants of the mountainous regions from Lebanon to Misrephoth Maim, that is, all the Sidonians, I myself will drive them out before the Israelites."
So God is doing some of the driving out. I know there's passages in the Bible that talk about how He drives them out with the hornet, and I know that would get me out. I mean, I'm like
You
steaming.
always said growing up, there's only two reasons to run: if you
Yeah,
just hit a baseball or you're being chased by bees.
that was my two reasons. I don't like running that much, and I like playing baseball. So yeah, I like running after I hit the ball, and and I'm scared of bees. I've been
Yeah,
swarmed on a couple of times and by yellow jackets, and if they came, I would be running.
yeah,
So yeah, so God, in whatever means He used, was going to chase the people out of the land.
right. And finally, we have at the end of the book, Joshua directly makes a speech giving all the credit to God.
Joshua 23:1 through 11, he says, "After a long time had passed, and the Lord had given Israel rest from all their enemies around them, Joshua, by then a very old man, summoned all Israel, their elders, leaders, judges, and officials, and said to them, 'I am very old.'" Well, that's an interesting, great beginning there. He said, "You yourselves have seen everything the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake. It was the Lord your God who fought for you. Remember how I have allotted as an inheritance for your tribes all the land of the nations that remain, the nations I conquered, between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea in the west. The Lord your God Himself will push them out for your sake. He will drive them out before you, and you will take possession of their land as the Lord your God promised you. Be very strong. Be careful to obey all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, without turning aside to the right or to the left. Do not associate with these nations that remain among you. Do not invoke the names of their gods or swear by them. You must not serve them or bow down to them. But you are to hold fast to the Lord your God, as you have until now. The Lord has driven out before you great and powerful nations. To this day, no one has been able to withstand you. One of you routs 1,000, because the Lord your God fights for you, just as he promised. So be very careful to love the Lord your God. You have any thoughts
Yeah,
on that?
I like that verse. One of you routs 1,000.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not because of their how mighty they are. They in some ways were probably right to think of themselves as lesser than the people living in the land. If this is such a great land, so bountiful, then the people who live there should be pretty well off physically too. Should be strong and tall. And there are people wandering around in the desert, um, and they can't find enough food or water, so God has to provide for them out in the desert. So typically, you wouldn't think that group of people wandering into this more established region would have the greater strength, but it's because of the Lord fighting for them. And you were
Sure.
talking about God driving the people out before them, both in a temporal sense and a physical sense. That when they fight, God fights with them, and so the people are more afraid of them. And that's something too that talking about fear and morale, that's incredibly important in conflict. It's especially with our Hollywood movies. We love our violence and action films in America, and we tend to think of it as just well, whoever's the most skilled is always going to win the fight. But uh, the majority of the fight comes down to morale and who has more courage, who's more confident, and if somebody's unsure or afraid, they're usually going to end up running or losing. And so God was providing. Not only what was He actually fighting with them in a more literal sense, but He was providing them with the inspiration and the courage to persevere.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and for all we know, the inhabitants of Canaan had as good aim as like a stormtrooper in Star Wars or something, but maybe that was the Lord's doing. Um, yeah, and I thought it was interesting too. The one person routs 1,000. It has. We're going to hear more of things like that in the book of Judges, and certainly when you hear about David and his mighty men and the exploits that they do,
Mhm.
things like that, and even Jonathan, son of Saul, when he battles with his sword bearer, and they take out a whole bunch of people. So there's lots of cases where this happens in the Bible. But what I thought was interesting also is this call to holiness again. Remember the word of the Lord. Don't swerve to the left or the right. You're going into the land that God gave you, and remember who's going to dwell in that land with them, Caleb.
The Lord,
Yeah. So
well, and He already has been dwelling with them
yes, and He told them, when you go into that land, don't shed blood. So this is
of each other,
yeah.
right?
Don't murder people.
Yeah, innocent blood.
Yeah. And so yes, he was saying, remember all the law once you get into the land.
Right, and that's I should have pointed that out more clearly. I think that's what's providing them the word of the Lord, the fact that they've been given the law. And here in verse 11, He says, "Be very careful to love the Lord your God." That I think is what's providing the inspiration. We talked about in the Leviticus episode how all those laws of atonement are not just these rituals and sacrifices they had to go through. It was a way of moving forward, of being able to let go of guilt, so you can focus on the task at hand. And that's all of those types of things that we talked about. That's what's giving them the ability here, as well as direct help from God. It's giving them the ability to follow Him and to fight so many different peoples around them.
Yeah, it's the power of God that makes them amazing conquerors. And that's what we're trying to focus on in this episode, is that God makes us conquerors. And in the case of the Old Testament, here in the book of Joshua, he makes the Israelites great conquerors as they move into the land, a land he was punishing for their sins, much like we'll see later in the future when the Israelites get punished for not living up to the law in the land.
Yeah, they'll a little bit of foreshadowing there, but
Yeah.
they'll eventually lose the land. They'll be run
Mhm.
out of it.
Yeah. All right. So that leads us right into our Old Testament takeaway is that God makes his people conquerors. And so that's an amazing promise from the Bible. He makes his people conquerors. Remember, we've been saying the last few weeks, that he wants to live among a holy people. And that was one of our recent takeaways. And, now we see that he makes his people conquerors. And so one of you routs 1,000, as we said. So, any other closing thoughts on the Old Testament?
No, just kind of a little funny aside here. I'm just remembering my gamer tag growing up was always Caleb_Conqueror. We've seen
Yeah.
Caleb, the original Caleb Conqueror here in the in the Old Testament.
Well, you can look Caleb up, do a web search on him and find all of his old gaming records.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's turn to the New Testament and see what we find there. And remember the title of our series again is Who is Jesus Christ and Why Do I Need Him? And so we're going through the Old Testament and we're finding out what is God like, and then the book of Hebrews tells us that Jesus is the perfect representation, exact representation of God. So what we learn about God, that he makes people conquerors, we should see the same thing in Jesus Christ. So we're going to look at some passages about the power of Christians to conquer the world. And so we'll start with one about the Apostle Peter, actually, and some things that Jesus says to him in Matthew 16, verses 13 through 20.
When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah.
So I love this passage, and Peter shows that he is spiritually connected to God because he gets direct wisdom and knowledge from God through spiritual means. And so Jesus plays off of that and says, Simon, you didn't learn that from man. That's something you have a connection with God. And then he talks about people who have a connection with God, the church. We're the people who have a connection with God if we're holy. And so he's saying people like Simon, people like the people in the church, there's no way that the spiritual powers from hell can overcome those people.
Right. There's a really interesting quote from G.K. Chesterton, if you can believe it, referring to this verse. He says, "When Christ, at a symbolic moment, was establishing his great society, he chose for its cornerstone neither the brilliant Paul nor the mystic John, but a shuffler, a snob, and a coward. In a word, a man." And that's because if you know anything about Peter, he's always putting his foot in his mouth, getting in trouble, except for right here because he at least has the one truth that you need. And upon this rock he has built his church, and the gates of hell have not prevailed against it. All the empires and kingdoms have failed because of this inherent and continual weakness, that they were founded by strong men and upon strong men. But this one thing, the historic Christian church, was founded on a weak man, and for that reason it is indestructible, for no chain is stronger than its weakest link. And I think that is such an insightful comment by Chesterton, because you look throughout the Bible, and the people that God picks as his typically his biggest conquerors and leaders. Moses was a stutterer, and he says, "Okay, you're going to be my messenger to Pharaoh and to the Israelites." And Moses is like, "Couldn't anyone else be a better choice? Not me. I'm not good at speaking." And God says, "No, you're the right one for the job." And then David was the youngest of his brothers, and and everyone overlooked him, but he's the one chosen to kill a giant. Peter, we can look at some stories later on when we get to the New Testament, some of the mistakes he repeatedly makes. These are the kind of people that God chooses to work with, but as Chesterton points out, all the empires and kingdoms, when we think in a worldly way, when we try to start something like that, a nation or a company or something, we're always getting the smartest, the strongest, the best people, and that is not the way that God thinks. God tries to find kind of like the diamond in the rough, somebody who needs some polishing off, because that person's going to be humble enough to listen to him, and those are the people that can have that kind of simple faith that Peter expresses here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think he raises people up. When God needs somebody, he raises them up to prepare them for the mission he has. Like a great example in terms of biblical inspiration would be like uh, King David. So God wanted a psalm written about how he was a good shepherd, how God is a good shepherd. So does he just look around and say, well, Caleb, you like to write poems and I need a poem written. So I'll have you write this poem for me because I think you're a great guy. No, because people wouldn't take a poem about shepherding from Caleb seriously because Caleb's never been a shepherd. Instead, he picks a kid who's the runt of the litter in his family. He's always stuck out with the sheep while his brothers get to go do cool stuff like fighting wars and such. And then he ends up, because of his strength of faith and courage in God, being a great warrior and killing the giant from the enemy. And then he rises up to become a great king. And so he goes from humble shepherd to great king, and then he writes a psalm about how God is a great shepherd. God, the greatest ruling power in the world, is also like a caring, loving shepherd. So, and that psalm's brought comfort to millions and millions of people. It's on like every funeral handout you ever receive.
Yeah.
So we see again, just like you have in the conquest with Joshua, that it's just normal people empowered by God. Like the quote that Caleb had from G.K. Chesterton, or like we see here with elevating the humble Peter to a spiritual leader. It's the power of God working through the man. And one other thing I wanted to add about that is, I think every generation, when they look at their own time, they say, oh no, this is the end of time. We're losing control of the culture. Everything's going crazy. Satan's about to win. And, how are we ever going to turn this around? We don't have the power to do it. And I think that last statement's probably the most true part of it all. It always looks that way. And we certainly don't have the power within us as men to control the culture, to shape the culture, to win the culture. But when we are spiritual men and women, and we know that what's happening is wrong, and we stand up for what we know is right, and we don't swerve to the left or to the right like Joshua encouraged us to do, that is when God wins the victory.
That's right.
So,
and
stuff.
we see in Luke 10:17 through 20, speaking of people being concerned that Satan's about to win, Jesus has just sent out a larger group of disciples, 72 disciples, and it says, the 72 returned with joy and said, Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. He replied, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. I have given you authority to trample on snakes and scorpions and to overcome all the power of the enemy. Nothing will harm you. However, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven.
So I was, I was really amazed by this passage, because that's the great thing about the Bible. Even though you've studied it your whole life, you read a passage again and you see something in it. And I was just stunned by this passage, because here comes a group of people back to Jesus who he sent out and commissioned to do these amazing things. And they come back saying, oh, Lord, it was amazing. Everything you sent us out to do, we were able to do it all. And we had such power. And Jesus has the ability to just see through, the weakness of man. He's like, okay, these people are getting way too inflated about this power I've given them. And so instead, he makes this amazing statement that I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. And I was like, what? Why did he say that? And then I started thinking about it. And it's like, well, he's telling them, oh, you think you have a lot of spiritual power? How about Satan? You think he has some? He has lots of demons that do his bidding. He has a lot of power. Is that what you think is cool, having spiritual power? I saw Satan get cast out of heaven. Is that what you want? Do you want to be cast out of heaven? Because you can have a lot of spiritual power and no heaven. And so I think he's telling them, think about what is the most important thing. Do you want to be holy people who dwell with their God like we know God wants from when we studied the book of Numbers? Our takeaway was God wants to dwell amongst his holy people, and Jesus makes that possible for us. Jesus is saying, I'm making this possible for you, but don't blow it by, becoming megalomaniacs on me here, right?
Yeah, like Satan. I love what you
Yes.
said. You could have spiritual power, but not have heaven. That's in verse 20, the last verse in that bit we read. He says, do not rejoice that the spirits submit to you, right? Like you said, Satan's got plenty of spirits that submit to him, plenty of demons that
Mhm.
obey him. Rather rejoice that your names are written in heaven. That's the more important thing.
Yeah, and the power that we have, or the power that we're granted by God, we should use that power for heavenly purposes. And this, and we didn't even talk about this. I forgot to talk about it when we were talking about Peter. Peter was given this amazing promise, and the church was given this amazing promise that whatever we loose in heaven and on earth is loosed in heaven. Whatever we bind on earth is bound in heaven. And that's what it's talking about is you, the friendships you make here, the people that you win over here, they're people's names you're writing into the book of heaven, just like Jesus is saying here, make sure that your name's written in heaven. Don't worry about how much power you have. And
Mhm.
it's not just you, but all the people around you. Use the amazing gifts God's given you to enjoy life with other people and bind as many people as you can in heaven.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And with this last verse, the Luke passage, um, I don't, this isn't an attack on anyone, but there are people who interpret things like where he talks about trampling on snakes and scorpions. You do have, uh, especially like up in the backwoods, these snake handling churches, and I think that's missing the point here, right? People will look at that, and there is a story in Acts where Paul gets bitten by a snake and survives. Uh, so it's not that God can't work those kinds of miracles as well, but I think you're right to say this is for heavenly purposes. It's not, Jesus is using an illustration there to trample on snakes and scorpions. If we're not supposed to focus on having the demons, obey when that we have the authority to overcome all the power of the enemy, as he says in verse 19. If we're supposed to rejoice less in that and more that we're written in heaven, how much less should we focus on the snakes and scorpions?
Right, because it's what you put your hope and your faith and your trust in. Do I put my hope and my faith that I can just grab a poisonous snake and get bitten by it and say, "Ha, nothing happened to me. Now I know that I'm saved." Well, I should have already
Yeah,
I should have already believed I was saved because God told me I was. And we talked about this earlier that he died for me before I was even born in our Exodus episode where we talked about the God of salvation, that God always saves first, calls to obedience second, but both parts are important, right? We mostly talked about how that's not the way people think about it enough, but um, but you still have to do the obedience side of it, and as Joshua called us to just a moment ago, don't swerve to the left or the right. And so I want to be obedient to God because He's already saved me. I don't need a snake to bite me and then have me survive to say, "Oh, I guess I really am saved."
yeah. I think that's an interesting way to put it because our original sin was looking to a snake for assurance of our relationship with God. The
Yes.
serpent told Eve that if you
Hmm.
eat the fruit, you'll be like God. And so, Jesus is promising, he's already promising us that he's with us, right? We saw in Numbers, he wants to dwell with us. So, we don't need to look to creepy crawlies to prove that. We already have his word on it.
Yeah, and I think Jesus was saying to these folks that came back to him, I think he was saying, okay, I mean, that's great, but don't put your hope in it. Don't what because you cast out demons. I mean, Satan can do it. You think you'll see him in heaven? No, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And so that was a really interesting passage. So then we have a little bit of a longer passage from John 16, which happens to be one of Caleb's favorite passages in all of Scripture. So I think I'll let him read it.
Okay. This is John 16:25 through 33. Though I have been speaking figuratively, a time is coming when I will no longer use this kind of language, but will tell you plainly about my Father. In that day you will ask in my name. I am not saying that I will ask the Father on your behalf. No, the Father himself loves you because you have loved me and have believed that I came from God. There's that confession of faith that Peter made, right?
Mm-hmm.
I came from the Father and entered the world. Now I am leaving the world and going back to the Father. Then Jesus' disciples said, Now you are speaking clearly and without figures of speech. Now we can see that you know all things and that you do not even need to have anyone ask you questions. This makes us believe that you came from God. And Jesus, you're going to get a little sarcastic here. Do you now believe? Jesus replied. A time is coming, and in fact has come, when you will be scattered, each to your own home. You will leave me all alone. Yet I am not alone, for my Father is with me. I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world.
Yeah, and of course, that last sentence is the reason why we have this verse in here. You have overcome the world. And we've been talking about, the conquest of Canaan, and we've talked about how one person routs 1,000. And then we started to kind of shift over and talk about how Peter was showing his spiritual power by getting wisdom from God. And we've talked about people having power over the things of this world, like scorpions and snakes. But now, we're starting to see that this world that we were just talking about, how every generation thinks it's sinking deeper and deeper, and how will we ever escape? This is how we'll escape. We'll escape through the power of Jesus Christ, because it's a spiritual battle that we're in. We're not battling the Amorites anymore.
Right. And we'll see that in Romans here too. But this is making me think maybe we should have spent a little more time in the Old Testament there, because there are examples in the conquest of the Holy Land where the Israelites will not listen to the Lord. When they do conquer Jericho, somebody takes some of the spoils for himself. All the spoil from the first city was supposed to be given to God, and somebody keeps it for himself. And then the next battle, this tiny little town called Ai, they lose. And they're like, what? Because somebody was getting kind of conceited about it. This is great. These are going great for me. And anytime they fight, without the ark ahead of them, they're anytime they don't listen to God's instructions and try to trust in their own strength, it always goes ill with them. And this is like what we're saying here, right? You shouldn't just rejoice in the power and in the success, but in the fact that God is with you.
Yes, and that's what we've been looking at all along in every one of the books of the Pentateuch, certainly, that we just finished up, that God has your best interests at heart. He wants to create an amazing world for you that you can never be depressed in. He wants to save you and call you to obedience, and he wants to dwell among you. He wants to give you the ability to atone for your mistakes so that you can move forward, and he wants to be in a covenant relationship with you, like we looked at in the book of Deuteronomy. And so now, what we're seeing here is without all those things in place, that firm foundation of a strong relationship with God, you're not ready to be the conqueror that God needs you to be on the spiritual plane in this world.
Right.
So very good. So then we want to look at Romans chapter 8, which...
Yeah, I was thinking of the Ephesians passage.
Oh, well, you want to skip ahead?
No. I just.
Okay. Well, so now I think, in my opinion, Romans 8 might be the greatest chapter in the whole Bible. It's like the high point of theology in the New Testament, certainly. And
if you needed like one chapter to sum up the whole point of the Bible and the gospel, that would probably be a good one.
Yeah, usually when somebody quotes me a verse and says, "Hey, where is this verse?" the first thing, if I'm not sure, I always go, "It's probably Romans 8."
Yeah.
Because all the most famous verses, and you'll hear several that you know as we read this portion of Romans 8. So I'll read that. Romans 8, 28 through 39. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. And those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. That's amazing, Caleb. That's pretty much a walkthrough of all the sessions we've done so
Yeah.
far. Okay, so anyway, verse 31. What then shall we say in response to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also along with him graciously give us all things? Who will bring any charge against those whom God has chosen? It is God who justifies. Who then is the one who condemns? No one. Christ Jesus, who died, more than that, who was raised to life, is at the right hand of God and is also interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble or hardship or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we face death all day long. We are considered as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus, our Lord.
Man, that's such an incredible promise at the end there.
Yeah.
And that's like a callback to Numbers. I mean, for God dwelling among us, you know.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting that the dichotomy of things that he presents there that we can't possibly lose to there they can't separate us from
Mhm.
Christ, but he has death and life. It's like, you hear that and you go, well, how could life separate me from you? And then you think, oh yeah, I just got done saying that it looks like our world's going to, the trash heap.
Yeah,
Everything in it seems to be drawing us away from him.
that's true. Right. And Paul makes that contrast elsewhere where he says to live is Christ, to die is gain. Right. So obviously because Christ told us he's going to prepare a place for us. So he's not with us now, as he was in his ministry. Uh, in life it's easy to get there's plenty to distract you. There's plenty going on.
Mm-hmm.
You could also, like the 72 disciples, get your ego inflated by your own success. And
Yeah.
so there are plenty of things that could come in your way.
And I think, like I described the situation earlier, well, every generation wonders, is this the end? And we'll never be able to recover. But when you look at this list of things, there is no power that could possibly separate us from God. And he's made us more than conquerors. It's more than conquerors. We don't have to win the physical battle anymore. We have conquered all these things already just by having faith in Christ's victory over death.
That's true. Yeah, it doesn't mean that, and then we'll see this in the next verse for sure. It doesn't mean that there isn't a fight to be fought, right? I think there's something natural and healthy even in the way that every generation thinks their problems are the worst. Their moment in history is like the most crucial, and I think in a way, obviously, you could take that too far. You could despair, or you could get too big of an idea of yourself and your own importance. But I think God did put you in this time and in the place that you are for a purpose. Right? He does have a purpose for you in that time, and for you, that is going to be the most important thing that you can do. Right? But obviously, the most climactic point in history was what happened in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we shouldn't think everything hinges on what we're doing now. But that is what we are. There is something we're being called to do now.
And that important thing that you mentioned is what we cannot be separated from.
That's right.
His work on the cross is for us, and no one can separate us from that.
In Romans 6, Paul says that if you do you not know if you've been baptized into the cross, into Christ's death, and therefore also into his resurrection.
Yeah, amazing stuff.
So,
All right, so you're more than conquerors. You're even better than Joshua and all those people back there, and even Caleb.
yeah. I keep anticipating that Ephesians verse, and we're not there yet.
Caleb was just a conqueror, and now we're more than conquerors.
Right. Yeah, that's true.
All right, so
I'm going to have to change my gamer tag.
So, 1 John 5, verses 1 through 5, and another amazing passage. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome, for everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God.
And there again, that was Peter's confession, right?
That's true.
Yeah.
Yes, excellent.
That's why that's so key, because with that you're given the keys, right? That's what makes you part of the church. If you confess Jesus as the Son of God, then you're part of the church, which is given the keys of heaven, and you have power to loose and bind things on earth, and we can overcome the power of the enemy, as he said. But again, not because of anything that we can do. It's simply God's power working through us.
Yeah, and I love the emphasis on holiness again, talking about obeying God's commands.
Mm-hmm.
And that is loving God, and that is maintaining that covenant relationship, that covenant love that God has extended to us. So it's everything stays tied together. There's nothing, like we've said, there's nothing that we've been studying in the Old Testament that we don't see perfectly and exactly brought forth in the life and teachings of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, the book of First John, the Apostle John does such a great job focusing on the love of God. I mean, in this passage alone, he talks about God's love and our love for us several times. It's also twice in this book that he specifically says God is love, and for me, that's the book that my understanding of the Bible probably hinges on the most, because we've been looking back and seeing how everything that God did was done out of love. All of the atonement isn't some kind of cruel justice. It's a gift, and God wants to be with us. Why? Because he loves us, and in the covenant, what he asks from us is love in return. And First John does such a great job of focusing on that.
And we talked about in our very first episode, the God of creation, how the creation is a Trinitarian passage, because you see from John chapter 1 that Christ was the agent of creation, and he was there with God in the beginning. And we know that the Father was there, and the Spirit was hovering over the water. So you have this Trinitarian action. All creation was worked by all three of the parts of the Godhead and Trinity. And Caleb talked about then how God is internally relational. He's inherently relational, and how that's one of the elements in which God is love. Is he has a relationship with the three parts of himself. It's very interesting, but
Right.
But he
And I talked about in that episode how, for me, that's what makes the Trinity make sense.
Mhm.
Right? Before God created anything else, right? It's just him. It's just God. There's only one God, only one source of all things. But in First John, he says God is love. Well, so without creating anything else, how could God be love unless he in himself is a relationship?
Yeah.
G.K. Chesterton talks about that as he says our God himself is a society.
That's cool. All right. So once again, though, it's through this love, it's through this belief in Jesus Christ that we have overcome the world. And so this is not a physical thing. This is a spiritual thing.
Right. Yes.
So we've been talking from the Old Testament on about conquest and conquering and how we're now more than conquerors. So I wanted to read a little bit from Revelation just to show that there is still a conquest going on at the end of time, at the consummation of the times, that there's this giant spiritual battle. And we're certainly not going to be able to give proper treatment to this, just to kind of show that this battle is going on. It's a battle over time, and that God is in charge of it. But in the book of Revelation, when the seals are being opened, Caleb, you want to read what happens when the first seal is opened here in John,
cool.
in Revelation 6:1-2.
It's a cool visual. Imagine John being shown this. I watched as the Lamb opened the first of the 7 seals. Then I heard one of the 4 living creatures say in a voice like thunder, "Come." I looked, and there before me was a white horse. Its rider held a bow, and he was given a crown, and he rode out as a conqueror bent on conquest.
So at the end of time, there's going to be this conquest still going on. God purging the land, bringing in the holy, however you like to conceptualize it.
Right. If you recall in the Exodus episode, I drew a lot of parallels between the Israelites in the desert and the church today, right? That we were saved from our slavery to sin. They were saved from slavery to the Egyptians. They're being fed by the manna in the desert. We're being fed by the bread of life, the water of life, which is Christ. And we're not yet in our promised land. That's heaven. That's when the new heaven and new earth come. But here we see the conquest, right? The old earth will be conquered and replaced by the new heaven and the new earth. And
Yeah,
that will be the final victorious entry into the promised land, is what we see in Revelation.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's a lot like the Old Testament conquest, where you were leaving an old land and moving into a new one, because now we have this new heaven and new earth, and we're making a pilgrimage there to our final promised land.
And I meant to bring this up with First John, but maybe it goes well here, because this is kind of like the crossing the Jordan moment. A lot of times you'll hear that phrase used for somebody when a Christian has died, that they've crossed the Jordan, right, and gone into heaven. When the Israelites were about to cross the Jordan there, we talked about how Joshua was saying the Lord will fight for them, and one of you routs 1,000. That was at the end of his life, I think. And I wanted to point out in that First John verse where it says that what has overcome the world even is our faith, and that's important. Joshua was saying to remember the commands of the Lord, remember to love the Lord your God, and I was pointing out that it's not just this power that is with the Israelites, or what they're capable of physically. It's also their faith and the inspiration that they're getting from God, because a fight, even a real fight in the world, has more to do with morale. And I wanted to nerd out just a little bit. I haven't really talked much about Tolkien, although in episode 0 I introduced myself as being heavily influenced by him. Tolkien was a World War I veteran, so he would have been keenly aware with the difficulty of keeping up morale in battle. I mean, he was in, if you've seen, Quiet on the Western Front, or any kind of World War I imagery with the classic trenches, that's exactly what Tolkien was stuck in. And he understood how this worked. And I referenced earlier, kind of made fun of our American culture a little bit with our Hollywood and our violent movies. And some people will think or criticize Tolkien for being focused on war and on violence. That certainly seems the case if you've seen the movies. There are all these epic battle scenes that they spend a lot of time focusing on. When Tolkien writes the battle scenes, a lot of the action and the hand-to-hand combat is glossed over. He talks a lot more about the ebb and flow of courage, and he uses even the physical atmosphere of his make-believe world to represent that. There will be a dark cloud that comes over, and then a shaft of light will pierce through it, and the cloud will scatter. And he really understood this, that his villains, their greatest power is fear, and his heroes, their greatest power is the courage and hope and love that they inspire. And that's something for me, because I'm a complete Tolkien geek. I see a lot of, I know he had to, because he was a devout Catholic. I know he had to get those ideas from this kind of stuff that we're talking about, that it's the faith which overcomes, and it's the love of God which overcomes, and not just power.
Did you have a reading? Or
No, not I could, but
Oh, okay.
it's kind of all throughout. I'd love to just read, the entire Lord of the Rings on here, but
Oh, yeah.
we can't do
Okay.
that.
No, we're not doing that.
That would be illegal.
Well, part of what you were saying there earlier, you mentioned swimming or getting across the Jordan River as going to the Promised Land, going to your heavenly reward, and it reminded me of when your
Mhm.
grandfather passed away, my dad,
Yeah.
and local radio host Hallerin Hill came by to see him because my dad had been going to a Bible study that he was leading, and he came in with my dad's friend Joe Pace, and we all gathered around his bed and prayed with him, but he was unconscious,
Mhm.
and Joe prayed that he was swimming hard to get across the river, and the next day on Hallerin's show, and maybe I can get Hal's permission to play this or something
That'd be cool.
in our clip, but Hallerin, our basketball coach, quit at the local university, and some of the players were going pro, and Hallerin was talking about how much money they are going to make, as first round draft picks and all this
Mhm.
stuff, and that's all they really goes into their calculus. And then he stopped and he said, yesterday I was over at a guy's house and I just been getting to know him, and his friend was praying for him, saying he was swimming hard to get across the river. And he said, in times like that, when you're surrounded by family and it's those tough times, he said, money doesn't make any difference. And so,
Mhm.
um, anyways, you just reminded me of that episode. And so
Yeah, I was thinking of it too.
I'll maybe if I can get a hold of Hal and see if I have the recording, so I could play it on here. So, anyways, but thanks for mentioning that. That was cool.
Good news, everybody. I was able to get a hold of Hallerin, and I got his permission to play the clip on our podcast. And so I think I was pretty faithful to what he had said, even though I hadn't heard it in 10 years. But just to be true to him, let me play that for you right now. I believe this is from the 7 o'clock hour of the April 16th, 2014 Hallerin Hilton Hill show.
And all the young men that play college basketball, they have these great dreams of stardom. I mean, you can't play at that level if there's not some part of you that wants to be a champion, wants to play on that next level. So those young men want to play at the NBA. They want to make the big money. They want to, and for a period of your life consists of the stuff that you can get and the fame that you can achieve and all that stuff. Good. I get that. But life is way more than that stuff. I went by to visit a guy that I just started to get to know last year. And he's right there, as his friend said yesterday, he's swimming hard to make it to the other side of the river. They don't expect him to live another 2-3 days. And I'm standing there at the guy's bedside. His family's around him, and I'm thinking, yeah, life is about a little bit more than what you make and what you take.
Thank you, Hallerin, for letting us use that clip, and now we'll get back to the podcast.
So, at long last, we get to a passage Caleb's been looking forward to in Ephesians.
We kept thinking we were about to. It's because I wrote it in my notes, and then earlier on, I hadn't even made it through the slideshow. Yeah. I was like, oh man, we got to quote this. So I wrote it in early, and then it showed up later. So I keep trying.
Well, so as we've been saying, and as we've hinted at, we're not sent here to conquer the people of this world, right? We're not here to fight flesh and blood. We're here on a spiritual conquest. And so we wanted to read Ephesians 6:10-12. And Caleb, why don't you read it since you've been looking forward to it so much?
Okay. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. And just for reference there, you could, if you want to read some more to do your homework, in the preceding verses there, Paul's talking about the armor of God. It's all spiritual. He's saying the breastplate of righteousness, right? The shield of faith. he's using that figurative language. So again, that's not a literal armor because it's not a physical fight, it's a spiritual one.
Sure. Yeah, just a powerful passage reminding us that it's a spiritual battle that we're in, and you need to be spiritually prepared. And a lot of the things we've talked about. How does Christ dwell among us? When we talked about that in our study of Numbers a few episodes ago, and we said that he dwells in His Word, He dwells in His church, He dwells in our hearts. And if you want Christ fighting on your side, you have to be into those things. You have to be, nurturing your heart spiritually. You have to be doing that by going to church and surrounding yourself with other people who also want their hearts nurtured. You have to be in the Word and studying His Word. Caleb and I started a whole YouTube channel devoted to biblical study. So we want people in the Word too. And so these are the ways that you prepare for spiritual warfare, so that when these battles occur, Christ is fighting with you. That's the way that one person can rout 1,000.
Yeah, and this there's something that happened here that's rather poignant recently in the news. As we're recording this, there was a bishop of the Assyrian Church of the East in Australia who was stabbed in the middle of a sermon. And this is something I wanted to point out. We are not called to kill for our beliefs, right? I don't want to get into the politics again. Like I said earlier, I'm not attacking any people here, but I do want to point out when there's a false belief, right? There was a radical Muslim who stabbed him in the middle of his service. And something that I think about a lot is that a person who's willing to die for their beliefs has a lot more faith than the person who's willing to kill for them. And if somebody, and especially, and there are extremists of all types, right? But especially when someone becomes radicalized in their beliefs, one of the telltale signs of that is that they start seeing their fight as a physical one. Unfortunately, Bishop Emmanuel didn't die, but we are not called to kill for our beliefs. Almost all the apostles probably were martyred, at least according to tradition. Some of them definitely were, and there were plenty of Christian martyrs in the early church in the Roman Empire. And if you feel the need to assert your beliefs like that so strongly that you'll start taking violent action against other people, I would suggest to you that you actually are not very confident in your beliefs. That seems like an insecure type of behavior. When we have that strong faith in God, like that Peter expressed, right, that Jesus is the Son of God, when Jesus tells us we'll have trouble in the world, but we can take heart because He's overcome it. Remember, He's already fought that battle, and we don't need to get caught up in what's going on in our times so badly that we start losing grasp of that and start trying to take things in our hands that are in God's hands. And somebody who is secure in their beliefs would be willing to stand there boldly and die for them. Somebody who isn't is going to feel the need to force them, if that makes sense. So that's something I wanted to point out, just because it's really important, and I think about it all the time. It's much more important to have right conversation and to live out your belief in your life, to press your beliefs peacefully by example and by faith.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of our taglines, one of our mission statements here at Biblocus is renewing your faith in faith. And there's a lot of reasons why I chose to put that on our descriptions and in our YouTube channel and such, and why we use it as a tagline, because there's so many reasons people are suspicious of faith anymore and religion, and it's bad, and there's all these bad publicity about it too. And there's a lot of ways in which it has been misappropriated and misused in society over the centuries and millennia. But Caleb and I want to strive to be people of faith before the camera here, and not be fake about it. And
hopefully when the camera's off too.
Yeah. And so, as a father and a son, I mean, we do that on purpose too, here in our family, in front of our family fireplace, to just sort of say, why can't we believe in the things that we used to believe in? Why can't we renew our faith in faith, family, faith? You know, these things are important, and so we want to emphasize them. We believe that the medium is the message, and so that's part of the reason we're sitting where we are and doing it here, um, because just being in front of a fireplace as a father and a son, we hope that conveys something to you that we feel it's important that I pass along, my understanding of the world to Caleb, and that he pass it to his children, and my parents passed it to me, and that's something that should happen in the home, um, in the family that God established as the core institution, really, of life and of the church.
Mhm.
And so that's the idea behind what we're doing, and hopefully it comes across. And I know we're just trying to have a conversation, and so we're not trying to make these Bible discussions the hottest trending thing. You probably haven't even gotten to this part of the video because it's an hour in.
Yeah.
So, but at any rate, we hope that they're a blessing to you. We hope they help you renew your faith in faith. So,
Right. Talking about, people having lost their faith in faith, thinking that religion is bad, is harmful. A lot of that comes from a bad reputation given to it by people who are failing to understand what we're talking about in this episode.
yeah,
What we've seen outlined through Joshua, through the Gospel of John, the book of First John, all these verses we've been looking at. If that's something you can relate to personally, anyone who's listening to being put off by religion, that comes from people who are misapplying it, right? They're misusing the prescription the doctor gave them, So, and I'd encourage you to go back and read some of what we've been looking at here in their fuller context, right? Like the whole book of First John, all the emphasis on love that's in there, or the Gospel of John, or Romans 8, that the chapter that Dad was saying pretty much sums up everything, really, in maybe the most concise place any part of the Bible manages to do it. People who, like the handle the snakes and things, or do these great big, big TV evangelists that do these healings supposedly, or things that kind of seem to show off their own power. That seems to run exactly against what Jesus was warning there, right? Don't
Yeah,
celebrate
that's
about
not
that
the thing to
power.
celebrate.
Yeah, celebrate that your name is written in heaven.
And I was just gonna say again, like we introduced Ephesians 6 by saying we're not here to conquer people, the people of this world, and
Right.
we're sent to conquer in the spiritual realms, and we're sent to lead people to Christ so that they can win the spiritual battle as well. And
Right.
so, yeah,
In that Ephesians passage, when Paul talks about the armor of God, the only weapon that he lists there is the sword of truth, the word of God, right? The Bible. And that's what we're studying here. This is our only offensive weapon. The most offensive thing we'll do is quote the Bible at you. So,
well, and it is a tool. It is a tool, but it's meant to be, read and thought about, not to use to hit people over the head with, as
Right.
has often happened. And so let's get to our New Testament takeaway. God makes us more than conquerors. And so we hope that you'll claim this promise for your life. Our prayer for you is that you will learn to overcome the world through faith in Jesus Christ and his life, his death, and his resurrection. We hope that you'll learn to renew your faith in faith, because that's the only thing that can save you from this world.
right. And the only thing you have to do, or the only thing that has to be done for you, is baptism, right? I mentioned that Romans passage where we've been baptized into Christ's death and therefore his resurrection. And all those verses we saw, Christ has overcome the world. Our faith has overcome the world. It's Christ's victory on the cross that makes us conquerors. That's the only thing necessary to gain that promise.
Baptism symbolically is a burial under the water and then raised back up to new life. So it's reenacting the faith journey of Jesus Christ to the cross and into the tomb and then out. And so, yeah, it perfectly symbolizes. And and then has a spiritual purpose as well, to provide you with membership in the body of Christ. So, all right. Well, he's Caleb and I'm Timothy, and thank you for listening to Bible Discussions on Biblocus, where the Bible intersects with your life. Please consider supporting our channel by subscribing to this channel, and that really helps with our work and the popularity of our videos. And so keep bringing the likes and the subscriptions and things in. All scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated, are taken from the Holy Bible, New International Version, NIV, copyright by Biblica, Inc., used by permission of Zondervan, all rights reserved. This program is copyright 2024 by Timothy Klingerman. God bless all of you.